The clink of polished silver and the soft pop of the vintage cork echoed through the dining room of the Belvedere estate, nestled on the cliffs above Pacific Heights. Moonlight spilled through towering arched windows, glinting off crystal chandeliers and white porcelain plates adorned with gold leaf. At the center of it all sat Isadora Lennox, matriarch of the Lennox family dynasty, an undisputed queen of this opulent world. She poured a delicate stream of Cabernet into each glass, her manicured hand never trembling, her smile fixed in a perfect display of composed disdain. Seated across from her was me, Samantha Hale Lennox. Wife to her son, Marcus. Professor of economics. Uninvited participant in yet another of Isadora's theatrical family dinners. "So, Samantha," she said sweetly, swirling her glass with the expertise of a sommelier, "are you still teaching? What was it again? That quaint little school in the city?" I set my napkin delicately on my lap and smiled, the kind that hides sharp edges. "I'm now a full professor at Westbridge State University. Just received tenure last month." "Oh, how lovely," Isadora replied with a tilt of her head and a subtle upward curl of her lip. "Someone has to introduce the youth to the basics, I suppose. Marcus, isn't that charming?" My husband shifted uncomfortably beside me. He knew this game all too well. Every family gathering came with its own menu of veiled jabs and forced civility. I squeezed his hand under the table, letting him know I could handle it. "She teaches graduate-level macroeconomics and global financial systems," Marcus offered, ever the peacemaker. "Her current research has national applications." Isadora's husband, Howard Lennox, the man who ran Lennox Trust and Holdings, one of the West Coast's largest private banking firms, chuckled. "Theory's fine," he said, slicing through his steak. "But until you've moved $1 billion in real assets, it's all just paper and pens." From the opposite end of the table, their daughter Meredith smirked over her glass. She'd recently been named Director of Asset Acquisition at the family firm. Her idea of success was tailored suits and quarterly bonuses. "Speaking of moving billions," Meredith said, lifting her glass in a toast, "Dad just finalized the merger with Meridian Valley Bank. That puts the firm's holdings over $200 billion. Now that's real impact." A round of polite claps followed, and Isadora beamed as if she'd signed the contract herself. I joined the applause, soft and composed, though my thoughts spun elsewhere. Meridian Valley Bank. The name was familiar for reasons I didn't share aloud. "You know, Samantha," Isadora leaned in, voice feigning concern, "Marcus says you've been working such late hours. If teaching is proving too much, perhaps Howard could find something administrative for you at the firm. There's always a need for organized minds in support roles." I smiled serenely. "That's very kind of you, but I'm actually leading a research commission for the Department of Economic Security. We're looking into systemic vulnerabilities in mid-sized financial institutions." Meredith let out a laugh sharp enough to slice glass. "So, spreadsheets and lectures. Sounds intense." I took a slow sip of my wine and changed the subject to her upcoming trip to Barcelona. Let them talk. Let them think. They had no idea that my quaint research was directly related to their latest celebrated merger. That night, Marcus and I drove back to our modest midtown brownstone. The air was thick with the scent of eucalyptus and coastal fog. He exhaled heavily as we pulled into our garage. "I'm sorry," he said softly, keeping his eyes on the steering wheel. "They just don't get it." "It's all right," I replied, powering on my phone. A confidential alert flashed across the lock screen. I didn't open it. "Not yet. They just don't see what you do," Marcus continued, running a hand through his hair. "How important it is." I reached over and touched his arm. "That's the thing, love. They don't have to see it." Inside, I kissed him goodnight and slipped into my study. A small, quiet room lined with shelves of financial theory, legal texts, and encrypted filing cabinets. I booted up my laptop and returned to the document that had occupied my nights for the last half year. United States Department of Economic Security, Special Commission on Risk Evaluation and Systemic Stability. Lead Investigator, Dr. Samantha Hale Lennox. The data laid before me in rows and columns told a story the Lennox family hadn't yet heard. Meridian Valley Bank's assets were dangerously overvalued, and their derivative exposure teetered on the brink of collapse. Their internal reports, which I'd analyzed in depth, painted a picture of a bank bloated with risk, hiding liabilities behind layers of clever but irresponsible financial structuring. The merger Howard Lennox had so proudly boasted about was no acquisition. It was an infection. In less than 2 weeks, my finalized report would go before the Oversight and Financial Integrity Committee. And when it did, Lennox Trust and Holdings would be facing not a press release, but federal scrutiny of the highest order. Let them drink their wine. Let them laugh at professors and quaint little schools. They didn't understand that theory, when applied with precision, becomes power. They didn't realize that the person they mocked was documenting the downfall of their empire in clinical, irrefutable language. The kind of language no press spin could erase. I closed my laptop just after midnight and stood at the window, watching the street lights flicker. My world was quiet, my reach unseen. But I didn't need applause. I needed impact. And that was coming. The morning sun filtered through the blinds in narrow golden slits, casting stripes across the dense stack of reports on my desk. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten somewhere between pages of spreadsheet formulas and government memos. I didn't mind. The silence of early dawn was my favorite time to work, no meetings, no distractions, just the steady rhythm of numbers and the quiet pulse of truth surfacing beneath them. I logged into the Department of Economic Security's secure research portal and updated the latest findings on the National Financial Vulnerability Model. My analysis was growing sharper by the day, each line of code and data input building toward one undeniable conclusion. Lennox Trust and Holdings had just consumed a toxic asset. Meridian Valley Bank, their new acquisition, looked impressive on paper. But beneath the layers of polished public disclosures, I had uncovered a foundation of crumbling loans, heavily leveraged derivative contracts, and highly questionable valuation methods. I had flagged irregularities months ago. Now, those irregularities had turned into flashing red warnings. A secure message popped onto my screen. From Martin Coe, Senior Risk Analyst, Federal Oversight Division. Subject: Preliminary Cross-Institution Exposure Review. Message: Your projections were accurate. Meridian Valley's debt instrument positions are significantly underreported. Request full audit. Will require your final model before Thursday. I responded immediately. Confirmed. Model nearly finalized. Uploading full risk map for internal review tonight. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I initiated the final validation process. Months of sleepless nights poured into every cell of the database, every hyperlink between risk nodes. My work wasn't speculative theory. It was forensic finance, peeling back layers of smoke and mirrors until only raw, uncomfortable truth remained. And the truth was this: the Lennox family's flagship institution was now dangerously unstable. The merger they hailed as a masterstroke was in fact a detonator attached to a larger systemic threat. Left unchecked, the exposure from Meridian's tangled derivatives could ripple outward, hitting municipal bond markets, pension funds, and private equity lines across the region. I leaned back and exhaled slowly, rubbing the base of my neck. This was no longer a private concern. It was a national one. Later that afternoon, as rain tapped steadily against my office windows, I joined a secure video call with the department's Special Commission on Financial Stability. The screen filled with familiar faces, officials from the Treasury, analysts from the Federal Reserve, consultants from risk firms. Jonathan Dale, my colleague and closest confidant in the department, opened the call with his usual crisp tone. "We've reviewed Dr. Lennox's preliminary findings," he began, nodding toward me, "and it's clear the Meridian acquisition presents significant risk. If Lennox Trust's leveraged positions unravel, we're looking at potential liquidity collapse in several secondary banks." "Dr. Lennox," said Margaret Singh, one of the Treasury advisors, "your model projects the tipping point within the next 60 to 90 days. Correct?" "Yes," I confirmed, screen sharing a 3D financial exposure map. "Assuming their current asset inflations continue, and unless they reclassify their liabilities, the firm will breach safe leverage thresholds within 7 weeks. Sooner if regional market volatility spikes." A pause fell over the group. "What do you recommend?" asked one of the SEC compliance leads. Full regulatory review, immediate. Request internal audit access from the firm under the Emergency Institutional Transparency Act. I also recommend freezing any further asset acquisitions or dividend distributions until solvency is confirmed. They nodded. The machinery of intervention had begun to grind into motion. That evening, Marcus came home carrying takeout and a hopeful smile. "I brought your favorite," he said, setting the bag down on the counter. "Thai noodles and that weird lemongrass soda you love." I smiled, rising from my chair, stretching away hours of screen time. "You're a lifesaver." We ate in the living room, curled up under a blanket, rain pattering on the windows like a heartbeat. He didn't ask about my work, he knew when the time came, I would tell him everything. But as we finished dinner, I said, "They're in trouble, Marcus. Your family's firm." He blinked. "You mean the merger?" "I mean everything. Meridian's books are cooked. Howard bought a sandcastle and didn't check the tide." He sat back, stunned. "Are you sure?" "I'm beyond sure. My report goes live for internal regulatory review in 3 days. Once it's in the system, Lennox Trust will be under full scrutiny." He didn't speak for a long moment, just took my hand and held it tightly. "I don't know what happens to my father," he finally said. "But I know whatever you're doing, it's right." 3 nights later, the model was complete. The cascading risk simulation was chilling in its clarity, a multi-tiered collapse, with Lennox Trust at the epicenter. Default triggers. Credit freezes. A liquidity crunch that would echo across the West Coast banking system. And at the center of it all, an arrogant assumption that academic theory had no place in real-world finance. I uploaded the model to the Treasury Secure server and sent a final message to the oversight team. Model finalized. Recommend immediate classification for federal intervention. Attached full audit trail and supporting documentation. A new message appeared almost instantly. From Jonathan Dale. Message, understood. Treasury Secretary has scheduled a special session for Monday at 9 a.m. You're presenting. I read the words twice, heart steady. It was time. Back in the mansion on the cliffs, I imagined the Lennox family preparing for their next dinner, laughing over fine wine, oblivious to the avalanche heading straight for them. I thought of Isadora's raised eyebrow, Meredith's smug commentary, Howard's dismissive smirk. They hadn't just underestimated me, they'd underestimated reality. But I wasn't angry. I was focused. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about preventing a catastrophe. And teaching, in the most unignorable way possible, that sometimes the person they call just a professor is the one standing between their empire and its collapse. The sky was still dark when I arrived at the Department of Economic Security's headquarters. A pale hush covered the city like a prelude to something inevitable. I parked quietly beneath the granite-walled federal building and passed through security with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made this walk many times before. The guard at the front desk gave me a respectful nod. "Morning, Dr. Lennox." I nodded back. "It's going to be a long day." Inside, I was greeted by Jonathan Dale, already reviewing documents in the glass-walled conference room. He handed me a folder as I walked in, his face grim. "It's worse than even your model predicted," he said, gesturing toward the screen where real-time financial data scrolled like a storm radar. Lennox Trust initiated a quiet sell-off yesterday, probably trying to rebalance their books ahead of scrutiny. But it's already triggering market chatter. Treasury Secretary Wynne will be dialing in virtually in 20 minutes. I scanned the figures quickly. They're trying to cover a crater with a silk handkerchief. Jonathan smirked despite the tension. That may be the most poetic description of financial fraud I've ever heard. Let's make sure it's also the most public. At precisely 8:45 a.m., the Oversight Committee began filing into the room. Representatives from the Federal Reserve, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Office of Institutional Risk, and a dozen financial regulators took their seats. The room buzzed with tension and muffled conversation. A massive screen displayed the names of virtual attendees, including the Secretary of the Treasury herself. By 9 o'clock, the room fell silent. I stood at the head of the table. "Good morning. I am Dr. Samantha Hale Lennox, Chair of the Commission on Financial System Stability. Today, I present the findings of a 6-month investigation into systemic vulnerabilities stemming from the Lennox Trust Meridian Valley merger. Behind me, the lights dimmed, and I launched the presentation. Slide by slide, I unfolded the anatomy of a crisis. We have identified a 43% higher leverage ratio than publicly disclosed, I said evenly. This is largely due to hidden derivative contracts embedded within the acquired bank's balance sheet, many of which are tied to volatile offshore funds and synthetic debt vehicles. The first gasps came around slide 7. Further, Meridian Valley Bank classified non-performing assets as revenue generating through an internal revaluation method that violates standard federal accounting practices. Jonathan passed around a printout of the specific clause from the audit. Which brings us to the heart of the issue, I continued, advancing to a simplified diagram of cascading liabilities. Should Lennox Trust continue current operations unchecked, we are likely to see secondary exposure impact 12 mid-sized banks and 3 pension funds within 8 weeks. Worst case scenario, full liquidity lock within the regional market. The room went silent. For nearly an hour, I laid out every piece of data. Every manipulated ledger. Every reckless risk disguised behind polished reports. And then came the moment I had anticipated. The conference room doors swung open, and in marched Howard Lennox. He was flanked by his general counsel, his chief financial officer, and 2 visibly rattled assistants. His confidence, though intact, had clearly suffered. He scanned the room and then spotted me at the head of the table. His jaw twitched. "Samantha," he said, stunned. "What is this?" I didn't flinch. "Mr. Lennox. Please take a seat." He remained standing. I was told this was a Treasury oversight session. I gestured toward the screen, where Treasury Secretary Lingwen's face appeared. "Correct. And as chair of this session, I am presenting the findings on behalf of the Department of Economic Security." Howard's eyes narrowed. You've been leading this?" "Yes," I said calmly. "For the past 6 months." He looked around the room as if expecting someone to stop the absurdity. "She's a professor," he said, directing the comment to no one in particular. "Dr. Lennox," Secretary Wynne replied sharply through the speaker, "is one of the foremost financial analysts in the country. Her models are the foundation of our current risk assessment framework. Perhaps if you'd attended her last seminar on derivative contagion, you'd recognize her work." The words hung in the air like a guillotine. Howard sat down, suddenly very quiet. For the next hour, I continued my presentation, now with an audience that included the very man I was investigating. Howard's lawyer tried to interrupt. "This is a gross mischaracterization. Your firm classified subprime agricultural real estate portfolios as Tier 1 assets," I cut in, flipping to the next slide. "The mischaracterization has already occurred. And we have documentation from your own internal memos acknowledging the asset inflation." The lawyer sat back. I ended the presentation with a clear recommendation. "Given Lennox Trust's current trajectory, this committee recommends immediate regulatory intervention, freezing current asset transactions, suspending leadership duties, and initiating a full forensic audit." No one objected. Not even Howard. Outside the conference room, journalists were already gathering. News had leaked within minutes, headlines popping up on screens throughout the building. "Lennox Trust faces federal investigation over merger irregularities." Professor turned whistleblower leads Treasury session on banking giant. Market reacts as Lennox exposure exceeds projections. My phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "They just called Dad into the firm. CNBC is running your name." Mom dropped her phone when she saw the segment. I've never been prouder. I took a deep breath, stepping into the hallway as the session adjourned. Regulators and lawyers split into task forces. Howard stood alone, still processing what had just happened. He looked older, as if the weight of reality had finally caught up to his pride. He turned to me as I walked past. "You knew this for weeks. Why didn't you warn us?" I stopped. "Would you have listened?" I asked. He said nothing. We both knew the answer. That evening, Marcus waited at home with a bottle of wine and a quiet fire in the fireplace. He smiled as I entered, wrapping his arms around me. "You did it," he whispered. I nodded against his shoulder. "Not for revenge. For the truth. He kissed my forehead. And because you're brilliant. Later, as I scrolled through messages from colleagues, agencies, and news outlets requesting interviews and papers, I reflected not on the downfall of Lennox Trust, but on the value of patient work, quiet conviction, and unshakable expertise. They had dismissed me as just a professor. Today, they saw the truth. And tomorrow, I'd use that truth to make the system stronger for everyone. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. By noon the day after the Treasury hearing, Lennox Trust and Holdings had lost 47% of its market value. 3 major institutional investors issued public statements demanding clarity. By sundown, the Federal Reserve had officially suspended all non-essential transactions at the firm, and emergency auditors were dispatched to initiate a full inspection of the company's holdings. I watched it all unfold from a distance, through news alerts, regulator briefings, and the buzz of a phone that refused to rest. But I felt no triumph, no vindication. Only resolve. This wasn't a victory. It was a responsibility fulfilled. Still, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a small, quiet satisfaction in watching the house of cards tremble, especially when I knew how many times I'd been told to stay in my academic lane. Back at the Lennox estate, the mood was different. According to Marcus, it was chaos. Dad's pacing in the study, he told me over the phone that evening. Lawyers are in and out. Meredith's locked in her room. Mom hasn't spoken since lunch. I sighed, curled in my office chair with a stack of follow-up briefs from the Federal Oversight Board. They were warned without ever being warned. You were more than fair, he said gently. You let the evidence speak. Funny, I murmured. They never thought my kind of work could say anything. 2 days later, my inbox flooded with interview requests. Every major financial publication wanted to run a story. A few headlines already painted me as the quiet academic who stopped a collapse. Harvard Business Review even requested an op-ed on predictive modeling. But I declined the press, for now. The work wasn't done yet. The department had greenlit an expanded review of mid-size bank mergers using my framework. A new regulatory model was being developed under my supervision. What had started as a quiet research initiative was now reshaping national oversight policy. And in the center of it all stood the very person the Lennox family had underestimated for years. That Friday, as the city lit up for the weekend, I received an unexpected message from Isadora Lennox. Subject, request. Samantha, if you have a moment, I'd appreciate a chance to speak privately. In person. I hesitated. But curiosity got the better of me. She arrived at my office in the late morning, dressed in charcoal gray, her posture still regal but her eyes softer, less calculating. She looked around the room slowly, taking in the framed certifications, the awards, the photographs of me standing alongside policy officials and economists. I always thought your field was abstract, she began. But it seems I was wrong. I didn't say anything. I let the silence stretch. She gestured to the chair across from me. May I? I nodded once. Isadora sat, folding her gloved hands in her lap. We underestimated you. I underestimated you. It was the closest to an apology I imagined she was capable of. I tilted my head. Because I taught? Or because I didn't flash my credentials like a badge? Because I thought theory was irrelevant, she said honestly. Because I thought what we did at Lennox Trust was the only kind of real finance that mattered. And now? She smiled faintly. Now I see that the most dangerous risk is the one you refuse to study. We sat in silence for a few moments more before she asked, softly, what are you working on next? I leaned forward, unlocking my screen to show a graph of new community banking initiatives. Strengthening local and regional institutions. Ensuring they don't get swallowed up by mergers that prioritize scale over stability. Teaching them to build strength from the ground up. To my surprise, she seemed genuinely intrigued. You're turning this into something lasting. That was always the point, I said. When she stood to leave, she hesitated at the door. We're thinking of hosting smaller family dinners again. Less pomp. More connection. If you and Marcus ever want to come. I smiled, a real one this time. Maybe. But only if no one brings up mergers over dessert. She laughed, an unguarded, human sound, and nodded. Agreed. Back home, Marcus was reading the latest coverage of the federal intervention. "You're a case study now," he said, holding up his tablet. "They're teaching your model at Columbia and Wharton." "I didn't do it for recognition." "I know," he said. "That's why it means more." That night, we sat in the garden behind our brownstone. The city glowed around us, alive with possibility. I sipped my tea while he scrolled quietly through his phone. "Meredith started working with a nonprofit," he said eventually. "Microloans for underserved communities." I raised an eyebrow. "She says she wants to make real impact for a change. I think you shook something loose in all of us." Weeks turned into months. The fallout from the Lennox collapse was mitigated by swift regulatory intervention. No major crashes followed, no dominoes fell. The economy stabilized. Howard Lennox stepped down from his role and accepted a ban from executive positions in the financial sector. Surprisingly, he took a job teaching ethics in business at a local college. Meredith continued her nonprofit work. Isadora, shockingly, became one of the most vocal supporters of financial literacy programs, even joining a Treasury-led community education board I helped organize. It was surreal. But it was real. I had never wanted revenge. Only change. And I got it. A year later, as I prepared my lecture for the incoming graduate class at Westbridge State, I paused before a new plaque on my office wall: National Award for Public Service in Economic Reform, Dr. Samantha H. Lennox. Just below it hung a handwritten note from Secretary Wynne. "Thank you for reminding us that real power lies not in size, but in insight." 1 year later, my office at the Department of Economic Security overlooked the Capitol Mall, a glass-paneled room filled with sunlight and quiet purpose. The walls weren't adorned with trophies or power symbols, but framed articles, research citations, and a few meaningful photographs: students at their graduate thesis defenses, regulators signing new reform bills, a community banking summit where a dozen small-town lenders had adopted stability frameworks my team helped design. I hadn't planned to stay in Washington full-time. But after the Lennox Trust investigation, one thing led to another: policy discussions, advisory roles, think tank panels. Eventually, Secretary Wynne asked if I would help shape a permanent division focused on predictive oversight and ethical reform. It wasn't power I sought. It was impact. And that meant staying where the levers of change were within reach. That Monday morning, I reviewed the final draft of our national framework, the Hale Lennox Model for Community-Centric Banking. It combined the data rigor of macroeconomic forecasting with practical local adaptations, something traditional oversight models had long neglected. We just received word that it would be adopted by 4 state-level banking authorities by the end of the quarter. I was scanning a final chart on risk normalization variance when my phone buzzed. Text from Marcus. "Dinner tonight. 6 p.m. Mom's cooking again. Real food this time. She says she's banning foie gras forever. You coming?" I smiled. A year ago, that message would have felt impossible. The Carrington dinners, once polished affairs dripping with subtle put-downs and overcompensating silverware, had transformed. Now, they were held in Isadora's more modest townhouse just off Embassy Row. The decor was warm and lived in. The guest list smaller, more human. When I walked through the door that evening, I was greeted not with tight smiles or whispered glances, but with genuine hugs and laughter. Meredith was already setting the table, chatting about her latest microloan project with a startup in Detroit. Howard, now bearded and surprisingly mellow, wore a cardigan instead of his old tailored suits. He'd been teaching finance and ethics at a community college and, shockingly, loved it. Isadora appeared from the kitchen in an apron. "Yes, an apron. Samantha," she said with a warm, almost sheepish grin, "don't worry, I followed the recipe this time. You know I'll still bring backup sandwiches, just in case," I teased. She rolled her eyes, but with a smile that reached her eyes. Over dinner, we didn't talk about acquisitions or derivatives. We talked about impact. Howard shared stories from his students, some of whom had once feared math but now talked about budgeting and saving with pride. Meredith showed us photos from a community bank in Georgia that had used her nonprofit's program to build its first credit building initiative. Even Isadora chimed in. "I've started a women's finance circle at the library," she said, almost bashfully. "We meet twice a month. I use Samantha's curriculum, well, an adapted version." I nearly choked on my roasted vegetables. "You use my teaching? Don't get smug," she said quickly. I edited it to make it sound less like a dissertation. But there was pride in her tone. Marcus reached for my hand beneath the table and gave it a soft squeeze. "Look what you've done," he whispered. The next day, I was back in the classroom, guest lecturing at my old university. The lecture hall was packed with economics grad students, some sitting on the stairs just to hear the session. Today's topic: Applied Theory in Risk Regulation, Lessons from Lennox. I started not with charts or bullet points, but with a story. I was once told that teaching was theoretical. That real banking happened far from the classroom. That sitting in front of data made me naive to how economies truly worked. A few students leaned forward. But one day, theory met reality, and reality blinked. I took them through the story, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I showed them how academic work could not only expose risk, but rebuild trust. How research, when paired with integrity, could shake institutions to their core. "Your ideas matter," I told them. "Even when no one's listening. Especially then." As I walked out of the hall, a group of students caught up with me. "Dr. Lennox, do you think a professor can really change policy?" one asked. I turned to him, smile wide. "Not only can you, some of the best reforms in history began with a single thesis paper." Another chimed in. "How did you stay grounded when they underestimated you?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Because my work wasn't about proving them wrong," I said. "It was about proving the data right. And because impact doesn't require applause, just persistence." A few weeks later, I received a letter. Handwritten, on pale blue stationery. "Dear Dr. Lennox. I wanted to thank you personally. I used to be one of those people who thought academics were out of touch. But then I saw what you did, not just to fix a broken system, but to build something better. My daughter is starting college next fall. She wants to study economics. And she wants to be like you. Thank you for showing her that brilliance doesn't always shout, it often whispers. With respect." A former critic. On a sunny afternoon in April, I stood at a podium in front of the Treasury Department. A secretary handed me a commemorative plaque for my contributions to systemic banking reform. Reporters clapped. Regulators nodded. But my mind was on a different moment. 1 year earlier, sitting at a long dining table being told I was just a professor. They'd all learned the same lesson since then. That titles don't make someone powerful. Knowledge does. Character does. Integrity does. Back home, as I prepared dinner for just Marcus and me, I passed by the shelf where a small photo frame sat. It held a snapshot of my first class as a full professor, me, in a navy blazer, smiling beside a whiteboard of economic theory. That was where it started. Not in a boardroom. In a classroom. Where theory meets reality. Where young minds learn that they don't need a family name or a billion-dollar merger to change the world. They just need truth. And the courage to speak it.